Charlotte Hayes didn't cry when they took the farm. She didn't cry when they sold the furniture, the tools, or her father's boots. But when the auctioneer grabbed Penny's lead rope and dragged her toward the block, Charlotte's last living piece of home, something inside her chest cracked wide open. She pressed her fist to her mouth to keep the sound inside. She was 24 years old, completely alone, and the summer of 1878 was about to swallow her whole. If this story moves, you subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The Carson City auction yard smelled like horse sweat, sawdust, and desperation, and Charlotte Hayes fit right in. She sat on a wooden crate near the far end of the yard, apart from the crowd, her leather traveling bag balanced across her knees. Inside that bag was everything she had left in the world, a folded photograph of her parents on their wedding day. 43 cents in loose coin, a half-eaten biscuit wrapped in cloth, and a small silver thimble that had belonged to her mother. That was it. That was Charlotte Hayes at 24 years old in the summer of 1878. The farm was gone, not lost, taken. There was a difference, and Charlotte felt it in her bones every waking hour. Her father, James Hayes, had borrowed money 3 years ago when the drought hit and the crops failed 2 seasons running. He'd signed papers he barely understood, shaken hands with a bankman in a clean suit, and believed because James Hayes was a man who believed in people that things would turn around. They didn't. He died in March, a quiet death in a loud spring, and before Charlotte had finished grieving him, the bank had sent men to the farm with a court order and polished boots, and not one single expression of sympathy between them. They took the house. They took the fields. They took everything that had the Hayes name on it. Everything except Penny. Penny was a roan mare 14 years old, with a white star on her forehead and a stubborn streak that had driven Charlotte's father half to madness for a decade. She wasn't worth much on paper, but she had been Charlotte's horse since she was 10 years old, and she was the last thing in the world that still recognized her voice. The bankmen had tried to take her too. Charlotte had stood in the barn door with a pitchfork and told them very clearly, very quietly, that they would not. They'd checked the papers. Penny wasn't listed in the loan collateral. A mistake likely, or maybe her father had done it on purpose. Either way, the horse was hers, and the bankmen left without her. But 43 cents and a 14-year-old horse did not make a life. And so Charlotte had ridden 3 days south to Carson City because someone had told her there was work to be found near the railway depot, and she'd ended up at this auction yard because there was a water trough here and shade, and because she didn't know where else to go. She hadn't planned to sell Penny. She still wasn't planning to. But she was starting to understand that plans were a luxury. "Fine animal," said a man beside her, nodding toward Penny, who was tied to the post not 10 feet away, watching Charlotte with patient brown eyes. "What are you asking for her?" Charlotte looked at him. He was middle-aged, thick in the neck, wearing a cattleman's vest. His eyes moved over Penny the way men's eyes moved over things they already considered theirs. "She's not for sale," Charlotte said. "Everything's for sale at an auction yard, miss." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Not her. He shrugged and walked away, but he didn't go far. Charlotte watched him out of the corner of her eye the way her father had taught her to watch a dog that had shown its teeth once already. The auctioneer, a thin nasal man in a red vest, was working through a line of farm equipment at the far end of the yard. A plow for $3. A hand pump for $1.50. The crowd moved slowly, bored and hot under the Nevada summer sun, fanning themselves with their hats. Charlotte pressed her back against the fence post and tried to think. She had enough money to eat for maybe 2 more days. The boarding house on 2nd Street had told her a room was 50 cents a week, which she did not have. The railway depot was hiring women for laundry work $1 a week, but the woman at the desk had looked Charlotte up and down with an expression that said, "You don't look like our kind of worker," without ever opening her mouth. She needed something. Anything. Miss Hayes. She turned. A woman she didn't recognize was standing nearby, older with kind eyes and a sun-creased face. She worked at the auction yard, judging by the apron. "You're James Hayes's girl, aren't you, from up near Dayton?" "Yes, ma'am." The woman's expression shifted, soft, pitying, the expression Charlotte had learned to hate over the past 3 months. "I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man." "He was," Charlotte said. "I heard about the farm." The woman hesitated. "Are you all right, child?" "No. I'm managing, thank you." The woman nodded slowly. "You got anywhere to go?" "I'm looking into some opportunities," Charlotte said, which was a polished way of saying absolutely nothing. The woman reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small card. "My cousin runs a boarding house on Mill Street. Tell her Ruth sent you. She might give you a few nights on credit if you—" Charlotte Hayes. The voice cut across the yard like a blade. Charlotte's head snapped toward the sound. The auctioneer was standing near the main block, squinting at a piece of paper in his hand. Behind him, 2 yard workers were leading Penny forward. Charlotte was on her feet before she'd made the decision to stand. "What is this?" she called out, pushing through the small cluster of people between her and the block. "That horse is mine. She's not listed for sale." The auctioneer looked up. His expression was not unkind exactly, but it was entirely unmoved. "Ma'am, I have a lien notice here signed by First Territorial Bank. This animal is registered as collateral under the Hayes Farm account refiled 2 weeks ago." "That's not possible." Charlotte's voice was steady. Her hands were not. "She wasn't in the original." "Refiled," he repeated, tapping the paper. "2 weeks ago. Bank sent the order this morning. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. Can I see that?" He handed it down to her. Charlotte stared at it. The language was dense, legal, full of words that blurred together under the pressure behind her eyes. But she could see the date, April 14th, 1878, stamped in black ink, and she could see the words Roan Mare, approximately 14 years white facial marking, and she could see the signature at the bottom. Henry Carr, Vice President, First Territorial Bank. She'd met Henry Carr once. He had cold hands and a gold watch fob, and he'd looked at her father the way you look at something you've already decided to step on. "This is wrong," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "This is my father didn't include her. She wasn't part of the agreement. The refiling was done after he died." She looked up. "He can't have authorized this. He was already gone in April." The auctioneer took the paper back. He looked at it. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Maybe discomfort, maybe guilt. And then it was gone. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes. I don't make the legal determinations. I just run the auction." "Then stop," she said. "Stop the auction until this can be reviewed." "I can't do that. She is all I have left." The words came out raw. More raw than she'd meant them to. The people nearest to her went quiet. The auctioneer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am," he said, not without gentleness. "I'm sorry." He turned back to the block. Charlotte stood there. The world kept moving. The sun kept blazing. The crowd kept murmuring. Somewhere, a horse whinnied and a child laughed, and she stood completely still in the middle of it, watching them lead Penny up to the auction block, while her hands shook so hard she had to press them flat against her thighs. "Don't cry," she told herself. "Don't you dare cry here." Penny turned her head and found Charlotte in the crowd. The old mare's ears flicked forward. Her eyes, dark and patient and unbothered, as they had always been, found Charlotte's face and stayed there. Charlotte breathed. "What am I bid for this roan mare, 14 years sound in wind and limb?" $2. The voice came from somewhere to Charlotte's left. She didn't look. She couldn't. $2, do I hear 3? 3. 4. The bids moved slowly, crawling upward in single-dollar increments, the way bids did when everyone in the yard knew the animal wasn't worth fighting hard over. 14 was old for a working horse. Penny would pull a cart maybe, or carry a light rider. She wasn't a breeding prospect. She wasn't a ranch horse. She was worth about $12 to a practical man. Charlotte stood and listened to the number climb 5, 6, 7, and tried to calculate rapidly and desperately whether 43 cents could somehow become $12 in the next 30 seconds. It couldn't. $8, said the thick-necked man in the cattleman's vest. He was smiling now, not at the horse, at Charlotte. She understood then that he'd known. He'd come over and asked his price fishing question knowing full well what was about to happen. He'd been watching her the whole time waiting. $8 going once. 50. The yard went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a crowd being courteous. The sudden quiet of a crowd that has collectively stopped breathing. Charlotte turned. He was standing at the back of the crowd, and the crowd had parted around him the way water parts around stone. He was tall, not remarkably so, but tall enough that you noticed him with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than display. His hat was dark brown, worn at the brim, and his coat was plain and well made. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't performing anything. He was looking at the auctioneer with an expression of complete, unhurried calm. I said, $50. The man repeated his voice, carrying easily across the silenced yard. Low. Measured. The voice of a man who did not need to raise it. The auctioneer stared at him. Sir, the current bid is 8. I heard the current bid. He reached into his coat and produced a folded bill. 50. For the mare. The thick-necked man turned his smile gone. Now hold on. You're welcome to go to 51, the tall man said, still looking at the auctioneer. His tone was perfectly pleasant. The thick-necked man's mouth closed. $50? The auctioneer said, his voice catching slightly. Do I hear 51? Silence. Going once, going twice. He looked at the crowd, then back at the tall man. Sold to, he squinted. Sir, your name for the record, Calloway, the man said. Ethan Calloway. He walked through this parted crowd to the front, handed the $50 bill to the auctioneer, and took Penny's lead rope from the yard worker's hands. He ran one hand briefly down the mare's nose, a practiced, easy gesture, the gesture of a man who had spent his life around horses, and then he turned. He looked directly at Charlotte. She hadn't moved. She was standing 10 feet from the block with her traveling bag over her shoulder and her jaw set and her eyes burning, and she looked right back at him. He walked toward her. The crowd, still quiet, watched. He stopped 2 feet away and held out the lead rope. Charlotte didn't take it. What are you doing? She said. Returning your horse. His voice up close was unhurried. His eyes were gray, a particular shade of gray, like storm clouds just before they open. You just bought her. And now I'm giving her back. He held the rope a little further toward her. Charlotte didn't move. Why? He considered the question for a moment, as if it deserved actual thought. Because that lien filing was a fraud, he said simply. And because a bank that files paperwork against a dead man to take his daughter's horse isn't something I'm willing to stand by and watch. You don't know me, Charlotte said. No, he agreed. You don't owe me anything. Also true. So why? Miss Hayes. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, a directness, a weight, that made her stop speaking. Take the rope. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Penny, who had turned her head and was nudging against the sleeve of the man's coat with complete indifference to the drama unfolding around her. Charlotte took the rope. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Ethan Calloway nodded once. He started to turn away. Wait. The word left her mouth before she'd decided to speak it. He paused. She steadied herself. Who are you? Why do you know my name? Ruth told me, he said, nodding toward the auction yard woman who was watching from near the fence, with an expression that was trying very hard to appear casual. Said James Hayes's girl was here and having a rough time of it. He looked back at Charlotte. I knew your father. We did business twice years ago. He was a straight man. Charlotte's throat tightened. She nodded. I also know, Ethan said, that you've got nowhere to go tonight. She said nothing, which was, she supposed, its own answer. He turned his hat in his hands, a brief, almost unconscious gesture. I run a ranch called Silverest, about 12 miles east of here. Got good land, good horses, and more work than I have hands for since 2 of mine left in the spring. He looked at her steadily. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering work. Honest pay, a room and meals. You know horses clearly. I need someone who does. Charlotte stared at him. You don't know anything about my capabilities. I watched you hold this yard's attention while you argued with that auctioneer for 3 full minutes, he said, and there was something not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one at the corner of his mouth. And I watched your mare. She's calm. Calm horses belong to people who know what they're doing. Plenty of people would say that hiring a strange woman off an auction yard is not. Plenty of people say a lot of things, Ethan said evenly. I tend to judge for myself. The sun was lowering toward the western ridgeline. The auction had resumed behind them, the crowd drifting back to the ordinary business of the day. Charlotte stood in the dissolving quiet, with her horse's rope in her hand and the last of her options laid out plainly in front of her. She thought of 43 cents and a boarding house credit she hadn't secured yet. She thought of the railway depot woman's expression. She thought of another night sleeping in Penny's saddle, or in a church doorway, or not sleeping at all. She thought of her father, who had believed in people. 1 month, she said. I'll try it for 1 month. After that, we reassess. Ethan Calloway nodded. That's fair, and I'll work for my wages, she said. No favors. No, I don't want to owe anything beyond what I earn. Understood. I'm not good at being grateful, she added, because it seemed important that he understand this now. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement, not quite. Something quieter. Miss Hayes, he said, I didn't ask you to be. He walked to where his horse was tied at the post near the yard entrance, a dark bay gelding, big and solid, standing with the patient energy of a well-trained animal. He mounted, settled, and looked back at her. Rode east out of town past the mill. Silverist's got a blue gate. You'll see it before full dark. He paused. You all right to ride? I've been riding since I was 4, Charlotte said. I didn't doubt it. He touched the brim of his hat, a brief, unhurried gesture, and turned the bay horse east. Charlotte stood alone in the emptying yard, Penny's rope warm in her hands, and watched him ride away until the dust settled back onto the road. Ruth appeared at her shoulder. Good man, Ruth said simply. I barely know anything about him, Charlotte said. No. Ruth folded her hands in her apron. But you took the rope. Charlotte looked down at her hands, then at Penny, who blinked at her with enormous patience. I did, she said quietly. She tightened her grip, picked up her bag, and started walking toward the gate. The summer sun was hot on her back. The road east stretched long and pale through the Nevada dust. She had 43 cents, a 14-year-old mare, and the name of a ranch with a blue gate. It was not much, but it was the first thing that had felt like forward in a very long time. Charlotte found the blue gate exactly where Ethan Calloway said it would be. It was older than she expected. Weathered wood paint, faded to a soft gray blue by years of sun and wind, but the hinges were oiled and it swung open clean when she pushed it. That told her something. A man who maintained the small things usually maintained everything else too. She rode through as the last light of day burned orange along the western ridge. Penny's hooves quiet on the packed dirt road that cut through open grassland toward a cluster of buildings in the middle distance. She could make out a main house, a long barn, a smaller structure that might be a bunkhouse, a water tower. Everything functional, nothing wasted. A dog barked twice from somewhere near the barn, then went quiet. By the time she reached the main yard, Ethan was already there, standing by the barn door, his bay gelding unsaddled and presumably settled inside. He watched her ride in without saying anything, which she appreciated. She didn't need commentary on the fact that she'd come. She dismounted, and her legs nearly buckled. 3 days of hard riding plus the emotional wreckage of the afternoon had caught up with her body all at once, and she grabbed Penny's saddle with both hands and breathed through it until the weakness passed. When she straightened, Ethan was still watching her with that same unhurried expression. "Barn's through there," he said. "Second stall on the left is empty. Hay's in the loft, Water's in the trough at the back." "I can find it," she said. "I know you can." She led Penny inside. The barn smelled like clean straw and horse and old wood, and somewhere in the warm darkness a horse shifted in its stall and blew softly through its nose. Charlotte found the empty stall. Penny settled forked hay from the loft with muscles that were genuinely protesting now and checked the water. When she came back out, an older man was standing in the barn doorway watching her with open curiosity. He was wiry, gray-haired, somewhere past 60, with the leathery look of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors. "That's Hank," said Ethan from somewhere behind her. "He runs the barn." "Hank Marsh," the old man said, extending a hand. His grip was dry and firm. "You the Hayes girl." "Charlotte," she said. "Heard what happened at the auction." He shook his head slowly. "Damn bank. Pardon the language." "I've used worse today," Charlotte said. Hank laughed a short, genuine sound and stepped aside to let her out. In the main yard, a younger man was crossing from the bunkhouse toward the main house, and he stopped when he saw Charlotte doing the particular thing that young men did when they encountered an unexpected woman, which was attempt to look like they hadn't noticed while very clearly noticing. "That's Danny," Ethan said. "He's been with me 2 years. Good worker talks too much." "I can hear you," Danny said from across the yard. "I know," Ethan said. Danny grinned. He was maybe 19 with a wide, honest face and sun-bleached hair, and continued to the house. Ethan led Charlotte to the main house door, held it open, and she stepped inside. The house was plain and clean. A large central room with a fireplace on one wall, a long table, wooden chairs. A separate kitchen through a doorway. A staircase against the far wall. Not elegant, not sparse, simply the home of a person who valued function and kept things in order. A woman appeared from the kitchen doorway. She was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with dark hair shot through with silver and an expression that assessed Charlotte in approximately 3 seconds and arrived at a verdict that seemed cautiously to be favorable. "This is May," Ethan said. "She keeps the house and cooks. She also runs most of what happens here, whether she's officially in charge of it or not." "He's learned to admit that," May said. "Took him 4 years." She looked at Charlotte steadily. "You eat today." "This morning." May made a sound that was not quite disapproval, but not far from it, and disappeared back into the kitchen. 10 minutes later, Charlotte was sitting at the table with a bowl of beans and salt pork and a thick slice of cornbread, and she was eating with a concentration that she suspected was obvious, but couldn't bring herself to moderate. Nobody commented on it. Ethan sat at the other end of the table with a coffee cup. Hank came in and sat down and ate his own supper. Danny came in, sat down, opened his mouth, caught some signal from Hank that Charlotte didn't see, and closed it again. They let her eat in peace. When she was done, May set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked. Charlotte wrapped both hands around it and felt something in her shoulders drop that had been raised since March. "Your room's upstairs," May said. "Second door on the right. There's a wash basin." "Thank you," Charlotte said. She meant it in a larger way than the words could carry, and she suspected May understood that because the woman simply nodded and went back to the kitchen. Charlotte looked at Ethan. "What time does work start?" He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Dawn." "I'll be ready." He nodded once. She took her cup and her bag upstairs. The room was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a single window that faced east. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, still dressed, her hands around the coffee cup. Outside, the Nevada sky was going fully dark, and the stars were coming out, more of them than she ever saw in town, more than she'd seen since she was a child, running barefoot through the fields behind her father's house. She thought about her father. She thought about the farm. She thought about Henry Carr's signature on that lien notice and the cold mechanical certainty of it. Then she set down the cup, lay back on the bed fully dressed, and was asleep in under a minute. She did not dream. She was up before dawn. Not because she was eager, not because she was trying to make an impression, but because she had spent her entire life on a farm where the animals did not care about your exhaustion or your grief or your 43 cents, and her body had simply kept the schedule without being asked. She washed her face, changed into her work clothes, She had 2 sets both worn and went downstairs to find May already in the kitchen, and Hank already in the barn, and Danny already inexplicably eating a second breakfast at the table. "You're early," Danny said, surprised. "So are you apparently," Charlotte said. "Danny's always up early," May said from the kitchen. "He just uses the time for eating instead of working." "That's a partial misrepresentation," Danny said to no one in particular. Charlotte went to the barn. Hank looked up when she came in, assessed her work clothes with a brief nod of approval, and pointed her toward the feed room without being asked to. She spent the next hour feeding, watering, and checking the 12 horses in Silverest's barn. She noted which ones were being worked hard and which ones were resting. Noted a slight swelling on the left foreleg of a chestnut gelding in stall 4 that she suspected was being undertreated, and said nothing yet because she had been here for approximately 8 hours and had not earned the right to offer opinions. Ethan arrived at the barn as she was finishing. He stopped inside the door, looked at the completed feeding rounds, looked at her, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You see anything?" "The chestnut in 4, she said. "Left foreleg. The swelling's been going longer than it looks. See how the hair's grown in around the edge of it. That's not this week." Ethan walked to the stall, crouched, ran his hands down the leg. He was silent for a moment. "Hank's been treating it." "With what?" He glanced back at her. "Come talk to Hank." They talked to Hank. The conversation was professional and specific, and Charlotte held her ground on 2 points where she disagreed with the current treatment approach, because she had learned the hard way that deferring when you were right didn't help the animal. Hank pushed back once hard. She pushed back harder with specifics. He listened. He didn't concede out loud, but that afternoon she noticed the treatment on the chestnut's foreleg had been changed. She counted that. 10. The first week at Silverest passed in the particular blur of hard, honest work that left no room for much else. She was up before dawn and working until after dark, and the work was everything: horses, fencing, maintenance, the 100 small demanding tasks of a functioning ranch that never quite got finished before new ones appeared. She was good at it. She knew that without vanity, the way you know things that have been tested. What she hadn't expected was how hard it would be to read Ethan Calloway. He was fair. She would give him that without reservation. He gave clear instructions, expected them followed, and didn't make a distinction between her and his male workers when it came to either the work itself or the pay. He paid her Saturday cash in hand, exactly what he'd said, which was more than the railway depot had been offering for laundry work, and which she suspected he knew. But he was also in some fundamental way unreachable. He was not unfriendly. He spoke to her regularly, mostly about work, sometimes at supper, about broader ranch matters. He listened when she spoke. He asked follow-up questions, which meant he had actually heard what she said the first time. But there was something behind his eyes that stayed locked. Something that only fully emerged when he was in the barn alone with the horses, and she'd caught at once that quieter, less defended version of him. And he'd looked up and found her watching, and the shutters had come down so fast it was almost audible. She understood privacy. She had her own doors that stayed closed. She didn't push. But she noticed. On the 9th day, something happened that shifted the carefully maintained distance between them into something less stable. She had been working with a young quarter horse named Arrow, 3 years old. Barely green broke, with more speed than sense, and a talent for finding new ways to be difficult. Arrow had been rejecting the saddle all week, and Charlotte had spent 3 mornings working through it methodically, earning the horse's trust in increments, not forcing anything. That morning, she'd gotten the saddle on clean for the first time, and ridden 2 quiet circles of the paddock before Arrow had relaxed under her. She'd been so focused on the horse that she hadn't noticed Ethan watching from the fence until she pulled up and he was there, both arms resting on the top rail, an expression on his face she hadn't seen before. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He said you can't force trust. You just have to make yourself worth trusting and then wait." Something moved across Ethan's face, at that something quick and involuntary that he brought under control almost immediately. But she saw it. "He was right," Ethan said. "He was right about a lot of things," Charlotte said. "And wrong about some." She paused. He trusted the bank. Most people trust the institutions they're told to trust, Ethan said quietly. That's not stupidity. That's just how it works until it doesn't. It was the most he'd offered her about anything personal in 9 days. She took it carefully, the way you handle something fragile. Did you ever lose something? She asked. Something you didn't think you could recover from? The silence stretched. A long moment where she thought she'd pushed too far, and he would close back up, and she would have used up whatever small measure of goodwill she'd built. Instead, he said, yeah, just that. Just the one word. But it landed with a weight that told her it was true. In a way he rarely said things, and she let it sit without asking more, because she had the feeling that the asking would break whatever had just briefly opened. After a moment, he straightened from the fence. Arrow looks good, he said. Another week and he'll be solid, she said. He nodded and walked back toward the main barn. She watched him go, and she thought about what her father used to say, that horses and people weren't so different when you got down to it. They both just needed someone patient enough to wait. It was May who dropped the first piece of the puzzle. 3 weeks into Charlotte's time at Silverest on a Tuesday evening when the heat had broken slightly, and they were sitting on the back porch after supper with their respective coffees, May said without preamble, "He had a wife." Charlotte looked at her. 4 years ago, May said. Her name was Anna. Good woman. Smart. She paused. She died. Fever midwinter. It took her in 5 days. Charlotte said nothing. He built half this ranch for her, May said. The east pasture fencing the kitchen in the main house. She wanted a proper kitchen. May looked into her coffee cup. He finished the kitchen 3 months after she died. Never said why, just finished it. Charlotte looked at the kitchen window, warm with lamplight from inside. Why are you telling me this? She asked. May was quiet for a moment. Because you're sharp enough to have noticed that he's carrying something heavy, she said, and smart enough to be careful about it. I want you to know that careful is the right call. Not because he's not worth knowing, but because he's not going to make it easy, and the worst thing you could do is decide that means he doesn't want to be known. Charlotte was quiet for a long time after that. I'm not here for that, she said finally. I'm here to work. I know, May said. That's exactly why I told you. The trouble arrived on a Thursday in the form of a man named Beaumont. Charlotte was in the main yard when the riders came through the gate, 3 of them, well-mounted, the kind of men whose horses cost more than her father's entire farm had been worth. The one in front was broad, red-faced, somewhere between 45 and 50, with the particular posture of a man who had never in his life been told no by anyone who could enforce it. He looked past Charlotte completely and called toward the main house. Calloway. Ethan came out of the barn behind her. Beaumont, he said. His voice had changed, not louder, not harder exactly, but different, contained in a new way. Beaumont looked down from his horse. I'm going to say this simply, he said. The Hendricks parcel went up for sale last week. I'm buying it. You've been running cattle across that land for 3 years on a handshake with old Hendricks, and that handshake ends when I take the deed. He paused. Which is Monday. Ethan was quiet for a moment. The Hendricks parcel is my only water access to the east pasture. I'm aware, Beaumont said. Without it, I can't work 40 acres of grazing land I've been building for 3 years. I'm aware of that too, Beaumont said. He smiled. It was the same kind of smile the thick-necked man at the auction had worn. Buy it from me. I'll sell it to you for twice the market price. You don't need that land, Ethan said. No, Beaumont agreed pleasantly. I just need you to know that I can take it. Charlotte had gone very still. She was standing 10 feet from this conversation, holding a halter that she'd been carrying to the barn, and she was watching Ethan with a focused attention she hadn't intended to be obvious. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. Everything about him was controlled the way a current is controlled by a narrow channel, not diminished, just directed. I'll contest the sale, Ethan said quietly. Beaumont raised his eyebrows. On what grounds? I'll find them. Beaumont studied him for a moment. Then his gaze moved to Charlotte, and he looked at her with the slow, appraising look of a man categorizing things. "Replaced your crew, I see," he said. "Interesting choice." The implication in his voice was layered and ugly. Charlotte looked at him. "I'm the horse manager," she said. "Is that right?" He didn't make it a question. "Among other things," she said. "And I'd appreciate if you'd finish your business and move along. I've got work to do." The silence that followed was approximately 2 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Beaumont looked at her with something that recalibrated from dismissal to irritation. One of the men behind him shifted in his saddle. Then Beaumont looked back at Ethan and touched his hat brim, and it was the most contemptuous version of a polite gesture Charlotte had ever witnessed. "Monday," he said. He turned his horse and rode out. His men followed. Charlotte watched them go, and when the gate had closed behind them, she turned back to Ethan, who was still standing at the barn door with his jaw set and his eyes following the road. "Who is he?" she asked. "Neighbor," Ethan said, "if you can call it that." "He's been after your land before," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at her. "Yeah." "How long?" "A beat." "Long enough." Charlotte looked toward the gate. She thought about the east pasture she'd been riding through for 3 weeks. The long grass, the clean water access, the 40 acres that Ethan had clearly poured work into. She thought about Henry Carr and his signature on a fraudulent lien notice. She thought about how many different ways the world had of picking people apart. "So what are you going to do?" she asked. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. When he looked at her, something had shifted in his expression, a fraction more open than usual, a fraction less guarded. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm not giving him the land." "Good," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "It's good land," she said simply. "You built it well. Don't let someone take it because they think they can." She turned and walked toward the barn. Behind her, she heard Ethan stand still for a moment, that particular quality of stillness that meant someone was processing something, and then she heard his footsteps following her back to work. She did not look back. But she was listening. The legal papers arrived on Friday morning, 2 days after Beaumont's visit, and they were worse than expected. Ethan read them at the kitchen table without speaking. Charlotte was there because May had asked her to come in for coffee before the morning rounds, and she watched him read, watched the way his expression didn't change, but the quality of his stillness did tighter, more deliberate. The stillness of a man holding something back that wanted very much to come forward. When he set the papers down, he said, "He didn't just buy the Hendricks parcel." May looked up from the stove. "He bought the water rights separately," Ethan said. "Filed them as a distinct transaction. Which means even if I contest the land sale, the water rights are already gone." The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight to it. "Can he do that?" Charlotte asked. "He did it," Ethan said. "Whether he should have been able to is a different question." "So the east pasture is worthless without water," he said. 40 acres of dry grass, 3 years of work. He folded the papers along their original crease, precisely the way you handle something you don't want to touch any more than necessary. He knew what he was doing. Charlotte looked at those folded papers and felt something sharp and familiar move through her chest, the particular anger of watching a system work exactly as it was designed to, against exactly the people it was supposed to protect. She had felt it when she'd stared at Henry Carr's signature on the lien notice. She felt it now. "Who's your lawyer?" she asked. Ethan looked at her. "I don't have one." "Why not?" A pause. "Because the last time I needed one, the process cost me more than it would have cost to just give the man what he wanted, and I swore I wouldn't put myself through it again." He said it flat, no self-pity, just the plain fact of a lesson learned the hard way. "This is different," Charlotte said. "Is it?" "Last time you were fighting alone," she said. "How many people in this county does Beaumont have his boot on? Because if it's more than a few, there are people who'll back you just for the satisfaction of watching him lose something." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that particular expression she'd started to recognize, the one that meant he was recalibrating something. "You think like a campaign," he said. "I think like someone who's already lost everything once and doesn't intend to watch it happen to someone else," she said. May set a cup of coffee in front of Charlotte without comment, but she was smiling at the stove just slightly, where she thought no one could see her. Ethan picked up the papers again. "I'll ride to town this afternoon," he said. "There's a man named Greer on 2nd Street who practices law. We've spoken before." He paused. "You want to come?" It surprised her. She made sure it didn't show. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "You can tell me on the way if you have any more opinions about how I'm managing my own legal problems." "I have several," she said. Danny, who had been sitting at the far end of the table eating his third biscuit and pretending not to be listening, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and caught Hank's eye across the table, and Hank gave him a look that shut it down efficiently. The ride to Carson City took 2 hours, and for the first 40 minutes of it, they talked about the East Pasture, specifically about the water rights filing, about the timeline of Beaumont's purchase, about whether old Hendricks had known what he was selling, and to whom. Charlotte asked questions, and Ethan answered them, and somewhere in the third exchange, she realized they had stopped sounding like employer and employee and started sounding like two people working a problem together. And from the way Ethan's voice had loosened slightly, she thought he had noticed it too. "How long has Beaumont been doing this?" she asked. "Coming at you." "Since before Anna died," he said. It was the first time he'd said her name. Charlotte held that, carefully, didn't react to it. "He wanted the South Water access back then," Ethan continued. "I said no. Then Anna got sick and he came around again while things were difficult. Thought I'd sell. I didn't." His jaw tightened briefly. "He doesn't forget." "Neither do you," Charlotte said. "No," Ethan agreed. "I don't." They rode in silence for a moment. The road was dry and pale, and the heat pressed down from overhead with the particular relentlessness of a Nevada summer that has no interest in your schedule. "She would have liked you," Ethan said. Charlotte looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, not her. "Anna," he said. "She had no patience for people who danced around things. She always said what she meant." A pause. "Drove me half to madness for 9 years, and I'd give—" He stopped, set his jaw. She was something. Charlotte said nothing. She understood this was not an invitation to respond. It was simply something that had needed to come out into the air, and the kindest thing she could do was let it exist without making it into more than it was. After a moment she said, "She sounds like she was." Ethan nodded once, and then quietly, "Thank you." She wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking her for. She didn't ask. Greer the lawyer was a small, meticulous man who wore his skepticism visibly, but listened with complete attention, which Charlotte had learned was the rarer and more valuable quality. He read the Beaumont filing 3 times, asked 6 questions, and then sat back in his chair and said, "The water rights separation is aggressive but technically clean. Contesting it directly will be expensive and slow." "So what do we do?" Ethan said. "We don't contest the water rights," Greer said. "We contest the original Hendricks sale on the grounds that Hendricks did not have clear authority to sell the water rights separately because the original deed language bundles land and water access as a single parcel." He pulled a reference book from his shelf and opened it to a marked page. "It's a narrower argument, but it's cleaner and it's faster." Ethan looked at Charlotte. She'd been reading the deed language over Greer's shoulder. "He's right," she said. "The bundling language is there. Paragraph 4, she pointed. Beaumont's lawyers either didn't see it or hoped you wouldn't." Greer looked at her with an expression that revised upward. "You read law. I read everything I could find when the bank came after my father's farm," she said. "I didn't read fast enough, but I read." Greer looked at Ethan. "Where did you find her?" "Auction yard," Ethan said. "I highly recommend auction yards," Greer said, and turned back to his papers. They rode back to Silverest in the long evening light, and the conversation had shifted into something easier, less freighted. Charlotte told him about the chestnut gelding's leg, which was improving. He told her about the quarter horse she'd been working, how Arrow had started as a disaster who'd thrown two of his previous hands, how he'd been considering selling the horse at a loss before she arrived. She talked about her father's method of horse gentling, the patience of it, the way he'd said that every frightened animal just needed to learn that you were predictable, that you'd show up the same way twice. "Is that what you were doing with me?" Ethan asked. She looked at him. "Showing up the same way twice," he said. "Predictable, until I stopped waiting for something to go wrong." The honesty of it caught her off guard. She held his gaze for a moment, steady storm gray, more open than she'd seen them outside of the barn, and felt something shift in her chest that she was not ready to examine closely. "Is it working?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She looked back at the road. Her hands were very steady on the reins, which required some effort. "Good," she said. They were 4 days from the court filing, and 7 days into a dry spell that had turned the grass gold and made everyone on the ranch move with a particular careful awareness when the fire started. Charlotte woke to Hank hammering on her door at 2 a.m. "East barn," he said when she yanked it open. "Get up." She was dressed and down the stairs in 90 seconds. The east barn, the smaller outbuilding they used for hay storage, and the 3 youngest horses, was lit from inside with a glow that was wrong in every possible way. Not the warm orange of a lantern, the hard, consuming orange of something that had decided to keep going. "How many horses?" she called to Hank running. "Cisco, the 2 mares from last month's purchase, and Arrow." Hank was already ahead of her, moving fast for a man his age. "Danny's getting the bucket line started. Wind's coming from the south if it gets to the main barn." Charlotte didn't wait for him to finish the sentence. She hit the east barn door at a run and stopped because the inside was already wrong. Smoke thick and low. One wall fully involved the horses screaming in the particular high register of animals that understand they are going to die. Her eyes found the stalls. Cisco first. The big roan in stall 1 was throwing himself against the door, whites of his eyes showing. She grabbed the lead rope off the hook by the door, went for Cisco, got the rope clipped to his halter while he was still moving, and held on through 2 seconds of pure animal panic until he felt the rope go taut and remembered that a taut rope meant a person, and a person sometimes meant out. She got him through the door and handed him off to Danny, who appeared from the smoke behind her. "Main barn fence, south paddock," she said. "Tie him and come back." She went back in. The 2 mares were in stalls 3 and 4. Stall 3 was Calmer, the smaller of the 2 mares, gray, pressing herself against the far wall, as far from the heat as she could get. Charlotte got her out in 40 seconds. Stall 4 was worse. The second mare was down, not injured but panicked past, standing trembling on the stall floor, and Charlotte went in, crouched beside her, put both hands on the horse's neck, and pressed, not pulling, just pressing, and said in the most level voice she could produce, "Up, come on, up." The mare's breathing was ragged. The heat in the barn was building toward the edge of tolerable. "Up," Charlotte said again, steady as she could keep it, and ran one hand down the mare's shoulder in the long, deliberate stroke her father had taught her for horses that had gone to ground in fear. The mare struggled to her feet. Charlotte got the rope on her and walked her out. She handed the mare to Hank and turned back to the barn. Ethan was suddenly in front of her. "Arrow's still inside," she said. "Charlotte?" "He's in stall 2. I'll be 30 seconds. The left wall is going." His voice was low and hard. "If that beam comes down, 30 seconds, she said, and went around him. She heard him say something behind her that she chose not to hear. Arrow's stall was the closest to the burning wall, which was why she'd left him for last. The horse was not panicked, which in some ways was worse, because it meant he'd passed through panic and gone somewhere quieter. He was standing at the back of the stall with his head low, smoke hanging heavy around him, and when Charlotte came in, he turned and looked at her with enormous dark eyes that were even now watching her face the way she'd trained him to watch her face, waiting to see what she'd do. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I've got you. I'm right here." She clipped the rope and moved, and Arrow moved with her, following her lead through the smoke, the way he'd been learning to follow her lead for 3 weeks, and they came out of the barn door into the night air. 30 seconds before the left wall collapsed inward in a crash of sparks and burning timber that lit up the entire yard. Charlotte staggered forward, coughing, Arrow pressed close against her shoulder. Ethan's hands were on her arms before she'd stopped moving, turning her toward him, and she looked up to find him with an expression on his face that she had never seen before. Something raw and frightened and furious. All at once, the face of a man who had been bracing to watch something terrible and was still processing that it hadn't happened. "I told you 30 seconds, she managed between coughs. "Don't," he said. His hands were tight on her arms. "Don't make that into a joke right now." She looked at him. In the orange light of the burning barn, his eyes were not gray at all. They were something darker and more open, and she understood suddenly and with perfect clarity that what she was seeing in his face was not the reaction of an employer watching an employee take a risk. She did not look away. "All 4 horses are out," she said quietly. "Everyone's out. I know." His hands eased on her arms, but didn't let go entirely. "I know they are." Behind them, Danny and Hank were working the bucket line with 2 of the hands from the main house keeping the fire from spreading. The east barn was going to be a loss. She could see that already, but the wind had shifted, and the main structure was safe. The horses were in the south paddock, all 4 of them visible and breathing. The crisis was over, which left only the aftermath, which was Ethan Calloway standing 2 feet from her in the middle of the night with his hands still loose on her arms and an expression on his face that he had not yet put back behind the careful gray wall where he kept everything else. "You could have been hurt," he said. It came out lower than she'd ever heard him, stripped of the measured quality he usually maintained. "That wall, if your timing had been off by—" "It wasn't," she said, "but it could have been." "Ethan." She said his name for the first time and felt him go still. "I made the calculation. The horse was there. The time was there. I knew what I was doing." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said at last. "You did." His hands dropped from her arms. They stood in the space between them, which was not very much space, and the fire crackled behind them, and Arrow shifted his weight against Charlotte's shoulder, and somewhere across the yard, Hank was calling orders in his steady, carrying voice. "What started it?" Charlotte asked. The question broke something. Ethan's expression shifted from that open, unguarded thing back toward something harder and more deliberate. He turned and looked at the burning structure. "Hank said the north corner," he said, "against the fence line. And the fence line runs along the road," he said, "the road that Beaumont's men used to access the north section of the Hendricks parcel." Charlotte was very still. "You think it was set?" "I think," Ethan said carefully, "that fires in dry barns in summer are not unusual, and I think that the timing 4 days before the court filing is interesting." "That's arson." "I can't prove that yet." "But you believe it." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were clear and hard and decided. "Yeah," he said. "I do." The fire burned lower. The night pressed in around them, warm and close and smelling of smoke. Charlotte looked at the ruin of the east barn and thought about Beaumont's smile and his cold, pleasant voice saying Monday. She thought about the folded legal papers at her father's kitchen table. She thought about all the different shapes that power took when it wanted to make itself felt. She thought about what her father had said, that you can't force trust. You make yourself worth trusting, and then you wait. She turned to Ethan. "What do you need?" she said. He looked at her. "To fight this," she said. "All of it, the water rights, the legal filing, this." She gestured toward the smoldering barn. "What do you need right now?" He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I need," he said slowly, "to not be doing it alone." Charlotte held his gaze. The fire had burned down to orange coals, and Hank was calling the bucket line off, and Danny was tying Arrow more securely to the south paddock fence, and the Nevada night was enormous above them, clear and full of stars, that had no opinion about any of this. "You're not," she said. Ethan Calloway looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not gratitude exactly, or relief exactly. It was something more complicated and more permanent than either of those things. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." He turned toward the main house to get the sheriff's deputy's address. Charlotte turned back to the horses who needed settling and water and calm hands moving over them in the dark, which was something she knew how to give. She did not examine too closely the way her chest felt walking back across that yard. Some things you hold in both hands before you look at them directly. This was one of them. The sheriff's deputy was a man named Aldrich, who arrived at Silverest the next morning with a notebook and an expression that told Charlotte everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. He walked the perimeter of the burned east barn. He crouched by the north corner where the fire had started. He asked Ethan 3 questions, wrote down the answers in his notebook, with the careful deliberation of a man who had already decided the answers didn't matter, and then he stood up and said, "Dry summer. These things happen." Ethan looked at him. "The fence line," Charlotte said from where she was standing 6 feet back. "The burn pattern starts at the fence line, not inside the barn. A barn fire that starts from inside lamp heat equipment. It starts in the middle or near a heat source. This started at the perimeter wall." Aldrich looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has decided a woman is talking and is waiting for her to stop. "And you are Charlotte Hayes. I manage the horses here." She held his gaze. "I also have eyes." "Miss Hayes." He closed his notebook. "Fire investigation isn't really... It's not a simple thing to read a burn pattern without training." "My father had a barn fire when I was 12, she said. "Lamp knocked over by a spooked horse. It started in the center and moved outward. This didn't." Aldrich looked at Ethan. The look said, "Can you control her?" Ethan's expression said without words, and with complete clarity, "No." "I'll note the concern in my report," Aldrich said finally. "But without a witness or physical evidence of accelerant, there's not much I can—" "Who owns land along that fence line?" Charlotte asked. "That would be—" Aldrich stopped himself. "Beaumont," Ethan said quietly. "It would be Beaumont." A silence. "I'll note it," Aldrich said again, and the way he said it made clear that noting it was the end of what he intended to do. He tucked his notebook away, touched his hat brim at Charlotte. The gesture managed to be both polite and dismissive simultaneously, and walked back to his horse. Charlotte watched him ride out and said nothing until the gate had closed. "He works for Beaumont," she said. "He doesn't work for him," Ethan said. "But Beaumont contributed significantly to the sheriff's election campaign 3 years ago, and Aldrich is the sheriff's deputy." He paused. "It amounts to the same thing. So we have no official investigation, a court filing in 3 days, a burned barn, and a lawyer whose argument hinges on deed language that Beaumont's people are going to contest hard." Charlotte turned and looked at him. "Tell me the thing you haven't told me yet." Ethan looked at her. "There is one," she said. "I can see it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Beaumont made me an offer 6 months ago. Buy Silverest outright. Good price, fair price even." He looked toward the ruin of the east barn. "I turned him down. And after that, he went after the Hendricks parcel." "Yeah. So this isn't about the water rights," Charlotte said. "It was never about the water rights. He wants the whole ranch. He wants to own everything east of the Carson River in this county," Ethan said. "He's been buying land for 4 years. Silverest is the last piece he doesn't have. And if the court filing fails, then the east pasture dies without water access. I lose 1/3 of my grazing capacity, and within 2 seasons, I can't maintain the herd I have." He said it plainly, no drama in it, just the arithmetic of a situation he had clearly done in his head many times. At which point, his next offer looks a lot more reasonable. Charlotte stood with this for a moment. She thought about the blue gate she'd ridden through 5 weeks ago, exhausted and alone, and almost out of options. She thought about the kitchen May had told her Ethan finished after Anna died, the east pasture fence she'd been riding through every morning, the horses in the south paddock that were currently eating Ethan's hay in contentment after last night's terror. "What if the offer isn't the end play?" she said. Ethan looked at her. "What if he doesn't want to wait 2 seasons?" she said. "What if the barn was a message and the message is sell now or the next fire is bigger?" The air between them went very still. "Then we need to move faster than he expects," Ethan said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "We do." Duh. Greer moved the filing to the next morning. Charlotte rode with Ethan to town and sat in Greer's office while the lawyer went through the amended paperwork line by line, tightening the language, shoring up the deed argument. She asked 4 questions that caused Greer to revise 2 paragraphs, and at the end of it, he looked at Ethan and said, dry as dust, "She does this professionally somewhere." "No," Ethan said. "She should." Charlotte ignored them both and checked the paragraph 4 language one more time. The filing went in at 11 in the morning. Greer said a ruling on the water rights separation could take 3 weeks, possibly 4. 3 weeks during which Beaumont would know they'd filed, during which the pressure would increase, during which anything could happen. On the ride back, Ethan was quiet in a different way than usual, not closed off but thinking, working through something. Charlotte let him. She had learned the difference between his silences by now, the ones that meant he was done talking, and the ones that meant he was building towards something. This was the second kind. "I want to tell you something," he said when they were about a mile from the Blue Gate. "All right," she said. "When Anna died," he said, "I thought the thing that would be hardest was the grief. And the grief was hard. I won't pretend otherwise. But the thing that actually nearly broke me was the quiet afterward." He kept his eyes on the road. She talked. About everything. The horses, the pasture, what she'd read, what she was thinking. The house went quiet, and it went quiet for a long time. Charlotte said nothing. "And then you showed up," he said. "And you talked about the chestnut gelding's foreleg, and Beaumont's deed language, and what my father said about trust, and the house stopped being so quiet." He paused. "I want you to know that I noticed that." The road was pale and straight ahead of them. Charlotte looked at it. "I noticed it too," she said quietly. He didn't say anything more. She didn't either. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and the space between their horses felt different on the remaining mile home, charged and careful, and not unpleasant. May knew something had shifted the moment they rode in. Charlotte could tell by the way the older woman looked at both of them in sequence, and then went very deliberately back to whatever she was doing in the kitchen, without saying a word, which was May's particular form of tact. Danny had no such tact. He looked at Charlotte, looked at Ethan, and opened his mouth. "Don't," Hank said from the barn doorway. Danny closed his mouth. Ethan went to deal with the insurance assessor who had arrived while they were in town. Charlotte went to the horses. She was checking Arrow's legs in the south paddock. All 4 animals had been moved here after the fire when she heard boots behind her and turned to find Danny standing there with his hat in his hands, wearing the expression of someone who has decided to say something regardless of consequences. "He hasn't been like this since before Anna died," Danny said. Charlotte looked at him. "I mean the way he was talking at supper last night and this morning, before." Danny turned his hat brim through his fingers. "I've worked here 2 years, and I haven't heard him talk that much in a week." "Danny," Charlotte said carefully, "I appreciate what you're trying to say, but I'm not trying to make it into something," Danny said quickly. He's had a rough couple years. That's all I'm saying." He settled his hat back on. "And you're good for this place, that's all." Charlotte looked at him for a moment. He was 19 and honest and not trying to complicate anything, just saying a true thing clumsily the way young people did. "Thank you, Danny," she said. He nodded, relieved, and went back to work. She turned back to Arrow and stood with her hand on the horse's neck and thought about what she was doing and what she wanted and what those 2 things were starting to look like from the outside. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it came from Henry Carr. Charlotte recognized the letterhead before she'd finished unfolding it, and something cold moved through her chest at the sight of that name. The letter was addressed to her, not to Ethan, which meant Carr had tracked her here, which meant someone had told him where she was. She read it standing in the yard. The language was careful and legal, and underneath the careful language, the message was simple. The lien, refiling on Penny, was being reviewed internally, and the bank was prepared to acknowledge an administrative error and close the matter contingent on Miss Hayes confirming in writing that she did not intend to pursue any further legal action against the bank regarding the Hayes farm estate. In other words, we'll give you the horse you already have if you agree not to come after us for what we did to your father. Charlotte read it twice. Then she folded it back along its creases and put it in her pocket and walked to the barn where Ethan was going over inventory with Hank. She waited until Hank had moved off, then handed Ethan the letter. He read it. His expression didn't change, but she had learned to read him well enough by now to see what was happening underneath. "They're scared," he said. "They should be," she said. "If what they did to my father's estate was fraudulent, and it was, and if I chose to open that formally, the bank's exposure is significant." She paused. "Greer told me as much last week. I asked him to look into it." Ethan lowered the letter. "You've been building a case." "I've been understanding my options," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't yours to carry," she said. "And because I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do with it." She took the letter back. "I'm sure now." "Which is?" "I'm not signing anything that lets them close this quietly," she said. "My father worked that land for 30 years. What they did to his estate wasn't a mistake, and if I can make it cost them, I'm going to." The steadiness in her voice surprised her. 3 months ago, she had been sitting on a wooden crate in an auction yard with 43 cents and no direction, and something had reorganized itself in the weeks since, settled into a clarity that felt like the woman she had always been working toward becoming. Ethan handed the letter back. "Greer handles estates," he said. "He's good." "I know," she said. "I'm going to talk to him this week." "I'll ride in with you," Ethan said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. He held her gaze. "I want to." She looked at him. The barn was quiet around them, the warm horse smell of it, the particular piece of a place that was maintained with care. She thought about what he'd said on the road about the quiet after Anna died, about the house being different now. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once, started to turn back to the inventory list, stopped. "Charlotte," he said. She waited. "You've been here 5 weeks, he said, looking at the list in his hands rather than at her. "And the month you said you'd stay is almost up." The words landed quietly. She had known this was coming, had been aware of the calendar without letting herself focus on it too directly, and now it was here plainly in the middle of the barn on a Tuesday afternoon. "It is," she said. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. He looked up then, and his eyes were direct and clear in the way they got when he was saying something he'd decided to say, regardless of the consequence. "Not just as the horse manager, as whatever this is becoming. I'd like to find out what that is." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something real, being considered with the weight it deserved. Charlotte thought about 43 cents, and Penny's lead rope, and a blue gate, and the east pasture under a Nevada sky. She thought about a chestnut gelding's foreleg, and a quarter horse who had learned to follow her face through smoke. She thought about a kitchen that a man had finished 3 months after the woman he loved died, because it needed to be finished, because some things you do even when they break you, because that is the only way through. She thought about what her father had said. "You make yourself worth trusting, and then you wait." "You're not an easy man to know," she said. "No," he agreed. "You keep most of yourself behind something." "Yeah," he said. "I do." "And you're still fighting a legal battle, and someone may have burned your barn, and the next few months are going to be hard." "All true," he said. She looked at him. "I'm staying," she said. Not because of the hard months I'm not interested in rescuing anything. Because the work is real and the people here are real and—" She paused just briefly. "Because I'd like to find out too." Something moved across his face that she could only describe as relief, deep and genuine, and not entirely expected, as if part of him had prepared for a different answer and was now recalibrating. "Good," he said. His voice was lower than usual. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected that. The horse management decisions go through me, completely. Done. And I pursue the bank case independently. It's mine. I wouldn't have it any other way. And," she said, and paused, and felt something warm and somewhat alarming move through her chest. "We do this at whatever pace it actually needs. Not because things are difficult and we're reaching for something solid. Because we want to." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the right way to do it," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her for one more moment, steady, opened the storm gray of his eyes entirely without the wall that had been there when she'd first arrived. And then he nodded once and turned back to the inventory, and she turned back toward the paddock, and the barn went on being warm and quiet around them. What happened next, neither of them saw coming. Greer sent a rider out to Silverest the following morning before Charlotte and Ethan had finished breakfast, which was itself unusual enough to put everyone at the table on alert. The note was short. Beaumont filed a counter-motion yesterday evening. He's not contesting the deed language. He's claiming adverse possession on the water rights, arguing continuous open and notorious use for the required period. If the court accepts the framing, the deed language becomes irrelevant. Come today if you can. Charlotte read it over Ethan's shoulder. She felt the shift in the room. May's hands going still at the stove. Danny looking between her and Ethan Hank, reading something in Ethan's face that made the old man set down his coffee cup with careful deliberateness. "That's not a legal argument," Charlotte said. "That's a delay tactic. Adverse possession on water rights requires proving exclusive use, and Silverest has documented its own water access for 3 years, Ethan said, which is less than the statutory period. The kitchen went quiet. "How much less?" she asked. 2 years less, he said. Charlotte looked at the note in his hands. She thought quickly through everything Greer had told her, through the deed language, through the timeline of the Hendricks sale, through every conversation she'd had in the past 5 weeks about this property and its history. And then she thought of something. "Ethan," she said, "before Silverest, before you built the ranch, who owned this land?" He looked at her. "My father. He homesteaded it in 1854. And the East Pasture water access. He built the original channel in 1857. Ethan's voice had changed. 21 years ago, Charlotte said. "That's documented. My father kept records of everything." His voice was very quiet now, and moving fast. "They're in the study. Land records, construction notes, water channel surveys." Charlotte looked at him. He looked at her. "That's 21 years of continuous open and documented water access," she said, "which is 7 years more than the statutory period." Ethan stood up from the table so fast his chair scraped back hard on the floor. Danny reached out and steadied it. Ethan was already moving toward the study. "May," Charlotte said, rising. "Can you get the horses ready? We're riding to town." "Already planned on it," May said, and she was smiling now, full and open and without any attempt at concealment. Charlotte folded the note, tucked it in her pocket alongside Henry Carr's letter, the 2 pieces of paper that together represented everything that had been taken and everything that could be reclaimed, and went to help Ethan find his father's records. Behind her, Danny let out a long, slow breath and looked at Hank. "She's something," he said. Hank picked up his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said. "She is." Ethan's father had been a meticulous man. The records were in 3 leather-bound journals, stored in the bottom drawer of the study desk, wrapped in oilcloth against the dry Nevada air. And they were exactly what Greer needed. Dated entries, surveyor's measurements. Construction notes written in a steady hand that reminded Charlotte painfully and immediately of her own father's handwriting. The kind of man who believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth writing down. Ethan stood at the desk, holding the first journal, and didn't speak for a moment. Charlotte watched him look at his father's handwriting and understood exactly what that felt like, and said nothing, because some things don't need commentary. Then he closed the journal, tucked all three under his arm, and said, "Let's go." They rode to Carson City in an hour and 10 minutes, which was faster than the road usually allowed, and said everything about the state of both their minds. Greer had the counter-motion papers spread across his desk when they arrived, and he looked up with an expression that was carefully neutral, the expression of a lawyer who had not yet decided whether the situation was salvageable. Ethan put the journals on the desk. Greer looked at them. "What are these?" "My father's land records," Ethan said, "from 1854 onward, including the East Water Channel construction in 1857. Greer opened the first journal. His eyes moved down the page. He turned to the water channel entry, read the surveyor's notation beneath it, and went very still in the particular way of a man who has just watched a losing hand become something else entirely. 21 years, Charlotte said. Greer looked up at her. "Continuous, documented, and predating the statutory requirement by 7 years, she said. His adverse possession argument doesn't just fail, it inverts. Silverest has the longer established claim." Greer looked at Ethan. "Where has she been my entire career?" "Auction yard," Ethan said for the second time. Greer closed the journal, straightened his papers, and picked up his pen with the brisk energy of a man who has just found solid ground. "I need 2 hours to draft the response. Can you wait?" "We'll be at the hotel across the street," Ethan said. They sat at a corner table with coffee they didn't particularly drink, and the 2 hours passed in a way that Charlotte had not anticipated, not tense, not quiet in the difficult sense, but easy in a manner that still surprised her when she encountered it. The ease of two people who had run out of reasons to perform anything for each other. Ethan told her about his father. Not the grief of it, not the loss he'd talked around those edges before, but the actual man. Thomas Calloway, who had come west from Ohio with $40 and a land grant and the absolute unshakable conviction that the territory was going to become something worth being part of. Who had built the East Water Channel with his own hands over 3 summers because he'd decided where the water should go, and he didn't see any reason to wait for someone else to move it there. "He sounds like you," Charlotte said. Ethan looked at her. "Decided," she said. "Once he made up his mind." "He was more stubborn than me," Ethan said. "I'm not sure that's possible," Charlotte said. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the full version of that suggestion she'd been seeing at the corners of his mouth for weeks. It lasted 3 seconds, and it changed his face completely, and she filed it away without making anything of it. "Your father," Ethan said. "Tell me about him, not what happened to him. Him." She looked at her coffee cup. "He laughed at his own jokes," she said. "Always. Before he'd even finished telling them. You could always hear him coming because you'd hear the laughing before you heard the words." She paused. "He was terrible at cards. He knew he was terrible and he played anyway. He said the point wasn't winning, the point was the table." She stopped. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "He would have liked it here," she said. "The East pasture. He would have stood in the middle of it and talked about what it could be." "What do you think it could be?" Ethan asked. She looked up. He was watching her with the full open attention he usually reserved for things that mattered, and she understood the question was not casual. "More horses," she said. "Quarter horses, specifically the breeding stock you've been building toward. You could double the operation in 3 years if the water rights hold. The East pasture has the grass for it." She paused. "And there's a section near the north fence that would take an orchard. Apple, maybe. The soil's right." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Anna wanted an orchard," he said. Charlotte held that carefully. "Then it should be an orchard," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not grief. Exactly. It was something that had moved through grief and come out the other side into something more like integration, like a man who had finally found a way to carry something without being bent by it. "Yeah," he said. It should. Greer's clerk appeared in the hotel doorway and waved them back across the street. The response filing was clean and decisive, and Greer delivered it with the quiet satisfaction of a lawyer who has not often had this kind of material to work with. He walked them through the argument one more time. The 1857 construction date. The continuous documentation, the 7-year surplus, over the statutory requirement, and then he set down his pen and said, "Beaumont's lawyers are good, but they can't argue with a dead man's handwriting." "How long until the ruling?" Ethan asked. "With this evidence, the judge may not wait for the full period. I'll request an expedited review on the grounds of ongoing economic harm." Greer looked at both of them. "I'd give it 10 days, possibly less." "And the arson," Charlotte said. Greer's expression shifted. "That's a separate matter. Without Aldrich moving on it." "Aldrich isn't the only deputy in this county," Charlotte said. "There's a federal land office in town. If the fire was set to influence an active property dispute in federal court, that's their jurisdiction, not the county sheriff's." The silence in the office was approximately 4 seconds long. "That is correct," Greer said slowly. "I'd like to write that complaint today," Charlotte said, "before we ride back." Greer looked at Ethan. "She handles the legal strategy," Ethan said. "I handle the horses." "That is a remarkably functional arrangement," Greer said, and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. So, the federal complaint was filed by 4 o'clock. The response to Beaumont's countermotion was filed by 4:30. They rode back to Silverest in the cooling evening, and this time the silence on the road was a different quality entirely, not the charged, careful quiet of two people holding something back, but the settled quiet of people who have done a hard thing and done it well, and are allowed now to simply be in the same space without managing it. They were half a mile from the blue gate when Ethan said, "Thank you." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to. There's a difference." He glanced at her. "You've said that to me before." She recognized her own words coming back at her and felt something warm move through her chest. "Fair," she said. "The journal," he said. "I wouldn't have thought of it. I've looked at those books 100 times and I stopped seeing them as evidence. They were just my father's handwriting." He paused. "You saw what they were." "You kept them," Charlotte said. "For 20 years, through everything that happened, you kept them. That's not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." They rode through the blue gate as the last light left the sky. The ruling came in 8 days. Greer sent his clerk out to the ranch on a Thursday morning, and the clerk was a young man named Peters who had never been to Silverest before and arrived looking slightly windblown and very important, and he handed the sealed envelope to Ethan in the main yard with an air of great ceremony. Charlotte was there. May was at the kitchen window pretending to wash dishes. Danny was standing near the barn, not even pretending to do anything except watch. Ethan broke the seal and read the ruling. His face did not change. She had learned to read past his face. She watched his jaw loosen by a fraction. She watched his shoulders drop by a fraction. She watched him read it twice, not because he hadn't understood it the first time, but because some things you need to read twice before you let yourself believe them. Then he looked up at Charlotte. "Water rights restored," he said. "Full access documented from 1857 adverse possession claim dismissed." He paused. The court also noted that the separation of water rights from the land sale was improperly executed and flagged the original transaction for review. May made a sound from the kitchen window. Danny said something that was technically not appropriate language and then said, "Sorry, May," reflexively without being prompted. Hank, who was standing in the barn doorway, nodded once, the deep, satisfied nod of a man who has been waiting for something right to happen and is gratified, but not surprised. Charlotte looked at Ethan and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully known she was holding. The east pasture. The water channel his father had built by hand over 3 summers in 1857. the 40 acres that would now stay what they were supposed to be. "Well," she said. "Well?" Ethan agreed. He folded the ruling and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he looked at her and said, "The orchard. I want to start planning it." She laughed a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him, because he looked at her with an expression of such uncomplicated pleasure that she had to look away before she did something she hadn't planned. "This fall," she said. "We'll get the soil tested this fall." "Good," he said. Peters cleared his throat. "There is one more thing," he said. "Mr. Greer asked me to also deliver this." He held out a second envelope, smaller, addressed to Charlotte. She took it, opened it. It was from Greer's office. Short, direct. The bank case review had been completed. Henry Carr's refiling had been ruled fraudulent, a deliberate misrepresentation of collateral in an estate already under dispute. The bank had agreed under the pressure of the federal review that Greer had quietly initiated to a settlement. The amount was not what her father's farm had been worth. It was not justice in the way that justice ought to look, but it was acknowledgement. Official documented acknowledgement that James Hayes had been wronged, and that the institution that wronged him was being made to say so in writing. Charlotte read it standing in the middle of the Silverest yard, with the Nevada sun on her shoulders, and Penny watching her placidly from the paddock fence. She did not cry. She had made a decision somewhere in the past weeks that she was done apologizing for surviving, and that crying in a yard full of people was not what she wanted to do with this moment. What she wanted was to stand in it and let it be real. So she did. After a moment, she folded the letter. She looked up to find Ethan watching her from 5 feet away, and his expression was the same open, unguarded thing it had been the night of the fire. No wall, no careful management, just him looking at her with full attention. "Good news," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "My father's name is clear." He nodded. And then he did something she had not expected. He reached out and put his hand briefly over hers, where she was still holding the folded letter, one steady, deliberate pressure, and then let go. It lasted 2 seconds. It was the smallest gesture in the world. She felt it for the rest of the day. Beaumont came himself 3 days after the ruling. He came alone, which was different. No riders behind him, no performance of authority. He came through the Blue Gate in the early afternoon and rode to the main yard and sat his horse and looked at Ethan with an expression that had moved past the cold pleasantry of his previous visits into something she could only read as recalibration. Charlotte was in the paddock with Arrow. She stayed there. She watched. "The Federal Land Office is reviewing 3 of my other property transactions," Beaumont said. "You did that." "Charlotte filed the complaint," Ethan said. Beaumont looked at her across the yard. She held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd held the auctioneer's gaze 6 weeks ago, and she felt the difference between who she'd been that day and who she was standing here now, and the difference was not small. "Smart woman," Beaumont said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was a man saying what he'd been forced to acknowledge. "Yes," Ethan said simply. Beaumont looked at the main house, at the barn, at the east pasture visible in the distance through the fence line. Charlotte watched him look at all of it, and she understood what he was seeing. Not land, not water rights, not a legal ruling. He was seeing something that had refused to be taken apart, something that had held together under pressure because the people in it had held together, and he was understanding possibly for the first time that this particular piece of what he'd been trying to own was not going to come loose. "I'll leave the north fence access as it stands," he said finally. "The road." "I appreciate that," Ethan said. It was not a friendship. It was not forgiveness. It was 2 men arriving at a border and acknowledging it, and that was all it needed to be. Beaumont turned his horse and rode back through the Blue Gate without another word. Ethan watched him go. Then he turned and looked at Charlotte across the yard, and she looked back, and what passed between them in that look didn't need words. Chate. That evening after supper, after May and Hank had said their goodnights, and Danny had disappeared to the bunkhouse with the slightly too casual energy of someone making a deliberate exit, Charlotte and Ethan sat on the back porch with their coffees in the summer dark, and the stars came out over Nevada, the way they always did. All at once, without apology, more of them than the sky seemed like it should be able to hold. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, "about the orchard, about you," he said. Charlotte looked at her coffee cup. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "You know that about me by now." "I do," she said. "So when I say that the past 6 weeks have been the first time in 4 years that I've recognized my own life." He stopped, set his cup down, turned to look at her directly. "I mean that precisely, not as a way of saying something else, just as the true thing." Charlotte looked at him. In the starlight his face was open and quiet and entirely without performance, and she thought about every version of him she had watched emerge over 6 weeks. The man at the fence, watching her ride, the man in the barn in the dark, the man on the road telling her that Anna would have liked her, the man with his hands on her arms after the fire, the man who had reached across and touched her hand for 2 seconds in a yard full of people and meant everything by it. "I'm not the same woman I was at that auction," she said. "No," he said, "you're not." "I came here with nothing," she said. "And I don't want what I'm building here to come from that, from having had nothing. I want it to come from choosing." "Charlotte," he said, and her name in his voice had its own weight by now, a particular gravity she had stopped trying to ignore. "I know the difference, and what I'm seeing when I look at you has nothing to do with what you didn't have when you arrived." He paused. "It has to do with who you are." She was quiet for a long moment. The night was warm and full of crickets, and the horses in the south paddock were shifting slowly, and the east pasture was out there in the dark with its water rights restored and its potential intact, waiting for an orchard in the fall. "Ask me something," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you were going to say," she said, "say it." He held her gaze for one steady moment. "Stay," he said. "Not for the month, not for the season. Stay and build this with me, all of it." He did not look away. "I'm asking you to stay." Charlotte Hayes looked at Ethan Calloway in the summer dark of a Nevada night, and she thought about her father laughing at his own jokes, and about a kitchen finished in grief, and about a blue gate that swung open clean, and about a lead rope placed in her hands by a stranger who turned out to be someone she had been waiting to know. She thought about what it meant to choose something with your whole self, not from desperation, not from gratitude, but from the clear-eyed knowledge that this was the right thing and the right person and the right life. "Yes," she said. Just that. Just the one word, the truest one she had. Ethan Calloway let out a long, quiet breath, and in it, she heard 4 years of carrying something alone finally set down. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the Nevada dark, while the stars burned overhead, and Silverest settled into the sounds of a summer night, the horses, the crickets, the soft movement of grass in the east pasture wind, and it was not an ending. It was the first night of everything that came next. Charlotte Hayes had ridden through a blue gate with 43 cents and a 14-year-old mare and nothing left to lose, and she had found not rescue, not charity, not the soft landing of someone else's strength, but the ground beneath her own feet, solid and real, and entirely hers. She had come with nothing. She was staying with everything.